Shalom, everyone, and welcome to the Shalom-abration, a celebration of the completion of our third Clean Speech Colorado campaign, Oseh Shalom, Words of Peace. Mazel tov! Congratulations! It's exciting to think about what we've accomplished together. Imagine what benefit and blessing we've brought into our own lives and into our community. With thousands of us sharpening our shalom skills and strengthening our shalom muscles. I want to thank every one of you for being clean speech champions. And I want to extend a mazel tov to the Jewish communities of Illinois who are celebrating Clean Speech Illinois today. May your massive efforts of learning to avoid Lashon Hara be a great source of merit and blessing. It's amazing what's going on here. We are changing the way we speak for the better. In tribute to you and as a special treat, I would now like to introduce a dear friend and a real clean speech champion, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin.
Hello, it's a particular pleasure for me to be here with the program of Clean Speech in Colorado, a program that is expanding into many other cities and that I look forward to eventually being a national program. I was very impressed when I was invited during the first year of the program by Rabbi Liban, and it's something I consider very precious. Many years ago, I wrote a book called Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, and I've revised it, really dealing with a lot of these same ideas, the concepts of Lashon Hara, not to speak unjustly of others, the concept of Onat Varim, not to hurt people when we speak to them. And what I want to speak about today is a mitzvah in the Torah, Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. Reprove, yes, you shall reprove your fellow man, v'lo tisa alav chet, but don't sin because of him. A lot of us, I would say that this is probably one of the most uncomfortable mitzvot, one of the most uncomfortable commandments in the Torah to observe, because it means that if you see somebody doing something wrong, you actually are supposed to go and tell them and reprove them. And that's very, very uncomfortable for most of us to do. And yet, there are two ways of understanding the latter part of the verse. Reprove, yes, you shall reprove your fellow man, and don't bear sin because of him. The way that would be regarded more as pshat, the simple meaning of the text is, if you were in a position to influence somebody who is doing something wrong to stop doing something wrong, then you're going to bear sin if the person continues to do it, because you could have influenced the person. And that is probably the basic meaning of the text. The rabbis, though, also understood, and don't bear sin because of him, as a warning, don't become self-righteous. Don't become one of those people who can criticize so strongly that you end up humiliating the other person. Because if you're criticizing somebody over what might not be such a serious matter, but you humiliate the person, humiliating a person is a far more serious matter. And very often when we think we're in the right and somebody else is in the wrong, and we start to reprove them, we are told to be righteous. We are not told to be self-righteous. And that's, of course, what the rabbis were concerned about. But if you can have an effect, there's a famous teaching in the Midrash that if you can affect your family, then affect them and don't bear sin because of them. And if you can affect your city, affect them and don't bear sin. And even if you can affect, so to speak, the whole world. Obviously, that's not going to be an opportunity that's going to present itself to most of us. But what should you do when you reprove somebody? There's some very wise advice offered by Maimonides, Rambam, who's of course the great 12th century scholar of Jewish law. And Maimonides offers very specific advice if you're going to reprove someone. First of all, and this is very key, to the extent possible, do it privately. Because obviously, anytime you do it in public, it's going to have an embarrassing effect, and it will, of course, make the other person more defensive. Secondly, do it in a gentle manner. The words of the sages are said gently. Divrei chachamim benachat nishmaim. And the Chafetz Chaim, one of the great rabbinic scholars of the 19th and first third of the 20th century used to say, when you're performing any mitzvah, you don't start shouting at people. You don't start shouting at people if you're putting on the tefillin, the phylacteries in the morning. And so don't start shouting when you're approving somebody. And also be patient. Don't expect that because you point out something that somebody is doing wrong, that they're immediately going to totally repent and totally transform their behavior. There was a rabbi named Simcha Zissel Sieb, who was one of the disciples of the 19th century great Jewish moralist Rabbi Israel Salanter. And he says sometimes a teacher will get angry at a student because by the third or fourth time that he's told them to do something, the student hasn't done it or hasn't transformed. And then the person should ask himself, do I always correct my weaknesses? Do I always correct my wrongdoings by the third or fourth time that I remind myself? Somebody who has a bad temper, for example, they have to work on it. And you have to see improvement in percentage terms. You can't judge somebody and expect them to be transformed immediately. So this becomes a very important factor in how you deliver a rebuke. I want to tell two stories where people criticized someone effectively and in two very, very different ways, and yet in both instances they made a deep impact on the person. Because very often, how do you criticize in a manner that's going to really bring about change? In one instance, there was a doctor who was a professor who was teaching at a medical college, and he was making the point to his students that no matter how sick a person is, how gravely ill a person is, you should never deprive a person of all hope. And there was one young student in the class, probably in his first year of medical school, who raised his hand and protested. He said, listen, we're not handholders, we're men of science, we're not clergymen. Our job is just to be truthful with people. And if there's no hope, make it clear that there's no hope. The story's going to have an unusual punchline, so don't get too shocked while you're hearing it. The professor said to the student, I think that attitude makes you unfit to be a doctor. And I therefore want you to leave my class, and I want you to go to the dean's office, and I want you to tell the dean that I think you should be thrown out of the medical school. You can imagine what an effort it is to get into medical school, so the student sat there frozen in his seat, not moving, probably not believing what he had heard. And a minute later, the professor said, I'm totally serious. Leave this room immediately and go to the dean's office. The student had no choice. He got up, and as he opened the door, the professor said to him, you can go sit down now. I just wanted you to experience for 2 minutes what it's like to be deprived of all hope. Was that student permanently changed? I don't know, but I'm sure some of the other 30 students or so in the classroom will remember that. Because if the professor had just said it, and nobody had reacted, and he had just said, no matter how sick a person is, don't deprive them of all hope. So some of the students might have written it down. Others would have thought, that sounds sweet, and it would, but because of the dramatic confrontation, it really had an impact. The second story, and I think I'm going to conclude with this, but the second story underscores that you have your biggest chance of criticizing and affecting a person if you first have established a social relationship with them or a friendly relationship with them. And what I'm going to tell you now is a story that is not at all widely known, but it's only become known in the last few years, and it's about Charles Dickens. Most Jews who are familiar with Dickens' writings know that he was a very popular writer. He exerted a big influence. He often wrote very sympathetically about the poor. But the depiction of a Jew in Oliver Twist is of a character called Fagin. Fagin is described as a Jew, and he's described as a particularly disreputable person. He provides miserable housing for young kids who have no contact with their families anymore and trains them to become pickpockets. And they have to bring him back. If they want to eat, they have to bring back what they've stolen. So you cannot think of a much, much worse figure. And obviously the Jewish community was upset when that book came out. Some years later, when Dickens, I think, was about 50, he had a beautiful estate and he sold it. And he sold it, it so happens, to a Jewish couple. And we can see from a letter he wrote at that time that he still was not so warm to the Jews. He said, my estate has now been sold to a moneylender. Let's see if I ever get the money. About a year later, though, because Dickens wrote a lot of letters, about a year later we find in one of the letters that he said, actually, I've never dealt with people who paid me so promptly and honored every part of the contract, and I find the woman, whose name was Eliza Davis, to be a particularly bright woman with whom I have very much enjoyed speaking. Sometime later, Mrs. Davis, Eliza Davis, wrote Dickens a letter soliciting a charitable contribution for a Jewish home, I believe it was going to be a home for the poor, to honor the memory of Judith, the wife of Moses Montefiore. Montefiore was the most known Jew in England. He had a friendly relationship with Queen Victoria, and she asked Dickens to contribute to it. And then for the first time, she raised the issue of Dickens having written so badly of a Jew. She said, it has been said, this is in her letter, that Charles Dickens, the large-hearted, whose words plead so eloquently and so nobly for the oppressed of his country, and who may justly claim credit for the many changes for the amelioration of the poor, has encouraged a vile prejudice against the despised Hebrew. And as she writes, Fagin, I fear, admits of only one interpretation, but while Charles Dickens lives, the author can justify himself or atone for a great wrong. Dickens took a few weeks till he responded, and when he responded, like many of us when we're criticized, he was defensive. He said, I can't imagine that Jews hold it against me that I created this one bad Jewish character. You know how many bad Christian characters I created? She responded within 3 days. He had written at such length that she realized he was defensive, which meant that something must have been bothering him a little. So she wrote back to him. She said, it is true that you've created many bad Christian characters, but you've also created very many noble Christian characters, but you've only created one Jewish character. And she noted that when Fagin was referred to in the book, on over 250 occasions in the novel, he was referred to as Fagin the Jew. So there was no way of escaping this. This time, Dickens didn't respond so quickly. He wrote what was to be his last novel called Our Mutual Friends. And clearly he was responding to the letters that he had received from Mrs. Davis. One of the characters in the book is a Mr. Ria, an elderly Jewish employee of a very bad fellow, but who's a pious Jew who risks his life to save two impoverished Christian girls who might otherwise have become prostitutes. And one of the girls is so moved by Ria's help that she calls out, I think there cannot be a kinder people in the world than the Jews. And near the end of the book, Dickens, again, I am certain, influenced by the letter from Eliza Davis, has Ria say the following. Men say this is a bad Greek, but there are good Greeks. This is a bad Turk, but there are good Turks. Not so with the Jews. Men find the bad among us easily enough. Among what people are the bad not easily found? But they take the worst of us as samples of the best. They take the lowest of us as presentations of the highest, and they say, all Jews are alike. Eliza Davis was so moved that when that came out, that she wrote and sent Dickens a handsome Hebrew-English Bible with a beautiful note, presented to Charles Dickens in grateful and admiring recognition of his having exercised the noblest quality man can possess, that of atoning for an injury as soon as conscious of having inflicted it. And Dickens replied, the terms in which you sent me, that mark of your remembrance, are more gratifying to me than I can possibly express to you. They assure me that there is nothing but goodwill between me and a people for whom I have a real regard, and to whom I would not willfully have given an offense or done an injustice for any worldly consideration. It'd be nice to report that Shakespeare had had a similar change of heart about Shylock, but it also shows that there are things you can do through friendship that can melt hearts, hearts that you thought were very hard and not open to being melted. Thank you so much.